Dear members and friends, thank you for joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be a very entertaining and perhaps even cheerful webinar in the midst of the series of somewhat depressing news cycles we've gone through this year. So speaking about the current year, we're now in 2020, and I'm old enough to remember that we were promised flying cars and space travel by now. So although we are not quite there yet, there is still a lot to discuss about the exciting innovations that we are seeing in technology, and especially for here today, how they may become relevant to your business. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. So Christoph Burgdorfer and Kevin Pereira, who will introduce you to 6 different ways artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things will change the way we do business in the future. So I will start with Kevin, who actually grew up in Hong Kong before living for America. So Kevin, you're currently a managing director at Blu Artificial Intelligence, which is a consulting firm that specializes in AI. And you started your career in private banking with Citi in New York, and then moved back to Hong Kong and joined the Bank of New York Mellon in the asset management side. And this is where you started a new group that specialized in products tailored to high net worth individuals. And I understand that you also worked at a technology startup in Myanmar that was building internet infrastructure, which included fiber optic, cell towers and data centers. And Kevin is also a part-time lecturer at the HKU, where he teaches an MBA course titled Artificial Intelligence for Business Leaders. And at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, he also teaches big data in finance. Kevin, thank you very much for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. And so Kevin will start first, and then after that we'll hear from Christoph, who is a Swiss tech entrepreneur who's working in Hong Kong, London and Tokyo. And Christoph specializes in the creation of digitally connected platforms. So he started with building telecommunications, billing platforms in Zurich and London. And with his own company, he created platforms for the pharma, automotive, marketing and global supply chain, shipping and retail industries. And then you exited the company 3 years ago, I understand it, to publicly list Asterio Corporation in Tokyo, with which you're now building the next generation AI, machine learning powered Internet of Things computing platform called Gravio. So I'm looking forward to hear about it, because I'm sure you'll have some interesting things to say about it within the next hour. So before I leave the virtual floor to our speakers to start the presentation, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. So may I ask everybody to always keep yourself muted and turn off your camera during the webinar, except for the speakers, of course, who will always have their camera on. I would like also to give a quick thanks to our sponsors for our Swiss Chime events, so LGT, Alpadis, Swiss and MSI Group. And now one word also about our events. While we are still, as you know, working under the social distancing restrictions, we have a number of things in the pipeline which we will update you on very soon, with a couple in-person events incoming. So be sure to watch your inbox or social media feeds for news. And we dearly hope Hong Kong is going to keep the current situation under control, so we have the pleasure to start seeing you all in person more often again. So without further ado, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. You have roughly 1 hour, around half an hour each, and then we will open the field to questions. I'm very much looking forward to your intervention.
All right, sounds good. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Gabriel. So let me just go ahead and share my screen here. Give me 1 second. And then just let me know if you can see the slides properly, and then we're good to go. All right, perfect. Thank you very much. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started then. So, Gabriel did a very good introduction, so I'm not gonna, go about this too much. As he mentioned, I grew up in Hong Kong, spent a bunch of time here. And for undergrad, I studied business, right? Which is not necessarily what you would expect from an AI guy. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about how that transition happened from business to technology, because I think it's something that a lot of people potentially think about, especially when they're working in Hong Kong and some of the finance careers here. Really enjoyed private banking. I thought it was a very good career where you start to develop your emotional intelligence. And I think some of that also translates pretty well over to artificial intelligence, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And also, as Gabriel mentioned, I've worked in Myanmar as well. It's an internet infrastructure startup there. So if anyone has any questions about technology in frontier markets, I'm also more than happy to take them during the Q&A that we'll have at the end as well. Okay, so real briefly, the company that I work at, we concentrate in AI, right? So we're consulting and we specialize in AI. And something that we noticed when we started the business was, initially in the first 3 months, nobody ended up coming to us. And we were always very kind of, worried at the time about that. And when we asked around, most people said that when they think about artificial intelligence, they feel either fear or confusion, right? And I think the fear comes from two areas. One is many people think about Terminator, Skynet, iRobot, all these robots about, or all these movies about artificial intelligence where, the end is never good for the human beings, right? So I think that creates part of the fear. And then I think the other part of the fear also comes from people worried that AI is going to take away their jobs, right? That's a very kind of common aspect that people have. So for the first part of what I wanted to talk about today, it's really going to be about that part of AI, right? And what can it do and what can it not do? I think it's important to have an appreciation for that. Excuse me. But in the time that we have on the consulting side, we do both consulting and then we also realize it's about education as well. It's the two parts of that value chain that you need in order for people and businesses to accept AI and to start using it. Related to also to that implementation part, there's also a big culture and change management aspect of AI that's also very, very important as well. It's related to the human component. And so I think, ultimately from a value chain perspective, those are the things that we concentrate on at Blu Artificial Intelligence. Okay, so if we're thinking about AI, I think it's important to first go into a little bit about what it is. And the truth is, even people in the industry actually struggle with the definition of AI. If you type AI into Google, you'll come up with something along the lines of these first two that we have here. A branch of computer science that deals with intelligent human behavior or simulation of intelligent human behavior. But I think the challenge here is, intelligent human behavior to me and intelligent human behavior to Christoph might be very different, right? And so I think it's important then when you have a definition to really think about what it actually means and to do it in a way that isn't scary or intimidating for the people using the technology. So the way I like to talk about it in my class at HKU and also with our clients is that AI is simply a tool to achieve an objective, okay? And if you think about it that way, then the emphasis actually becomes what is the objective or the business use case? I think that should always be everyone's primary thought process when they think about how to use artificial intelligence, how to use IoT, any type of technology that's out there. Because we've seen a lot of companies buy some really cool AI technology and then force it into a use case. That's a horrible idea. You always want to start from what is my use case or my business problem, and then figure out what is a tool that I need to address this. So if we think about what can AI do, right? I think it's very important to get a sense for what is this tool primarily used for. And I would say there's four main areas with artificial intelligence. The first one is really about processing large amounts of data. So with AI, you can give it spreadsheets upon spreadsheets, data, all sorts of stuff, and it can crunch through all of that way faster than any human being could. So in terms of scale of data, that's one huge area where AI is very, very good at. Now, the second one is patterns, right? So finding patterns and optimums. So again, putting a lot of data into an AI, you often have the AI figuring out what are the correlations between the variables. So for those of you who don't remember much about your high school statistics, correlation is the idea when you have two variables and they move in a certain way in relation to each other. Now, AI is very good at figuring that out. But where AI isn't so good and humans are much better at is about causation, right? Does A cause B? And that's where human beings and AI tend to start to work very well together. AI figures out the correlation, presents them to the human person, and the human person thinks about what's actually causing this. Is it pure coincidence, or is there actually some reason behind it? And so that's why that finding of patterns, right? Although that's a very big use case of AI, I just want you to keep in mind that it's figuring out correlation, not necessarily causation. Okay, so just something to keep in mind, kind of going forward. Now, you've also got grouping, right? And we'll talk a little bit about grouping in a second, but it's basically taking different data points and putting them into buckets. And that type of stuff, when used with things like customer segmentation, is actually very, very useful for a lot of businesses and industries. If you've got 100, different types of customers, you have a new product you're bringing out, who are the right people to target, right? That's definitely a grouping or customer segmentation exercise. And then the last one is extracting features from unstructured data. So if that means nothing to you, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it in the course of the hour today. But unstructured data is really data that's not easily organized or that's hard to get insights from. So examples of unstructured data could be video, could be sound, could be music. These are potentially harder to get signals from, but it's also where we're seeing a lot more of AI being used. Because if you think of your structured data, which would be like numbers in a spreadsheet, that's very easy to manipulate, right? You have functions in Excel, you can find the average, you can find the sum, like those are very easy to manipulate. But unstructured data is much harder to manipulate. And that's actually where we're seeing a lot more applications of AI. Now, if we think about the growth of unstructured and structured data, I think unstructured data is growing at a much faster rate. And a lot of this has to do with the hardware that we're using. So for example, and perhaps this is dating myself a bit, but I remember back in the day where phones did not have cameras, right? We actually used them to call people. But nowadays, we actually have cameras that not only are amazing, but you can immediately post everything you want to social media, right? So your Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and that's actually resulting in the creation of a lot of unstructured data. So in terms of data being produced, we all produce a lot of data, but the growth rate of unstructured data is much higher. And I think Chris will talk a little bit about some of those aspects of data in the IoT part, but I think it's important to keep in mind what are the trends with data, what's happening, and then how is this driving artificial intelligence going forward. Now, if we come to one of the myths, right, about AI, it's that idea that AI can take away your job. And I think it's very important to address this one because I think this is a big fear of AI that everybody has. So if we consider what is AI good at and what is human beings good at, one of the ways to think about this is that tasks that require massive amounts of computing but are not that wide are very easy for an AI, whereas for human beings, tasks that require less computing but are wider are easier. So let's actually put this in an example because I think it's easier to understand that way. So let's say we had a bunch of pictures of animals. And if we ask the AI, is this a cat or not a cat? That's actually very, very easy for an AI to answer. And the reason being is once you train the model, it actually has a template of a cat, and then it takes every other picture and just compares it. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and does that an X number of times per second. And so you can deal with a lot of computing power and you can have a lot of answers. But let's twist the question just a little bit. And let's say we give the AI those pictures and we ask, what animal is that? That's actually a very, very hard question for an AI to answer because it needs to be trained on every possible animal that's out there. Whereas if you give that to a 5-year-old child, it's actually very easy for them. This is a butterfly, this is a dolphin, this is a tiger, right? So I think it's very important to understand that there's a big chunk where AI is actually bad at, and therefore most solutions that we tend to see tend to incorporate both human beings and AI working together, which gives you this entire box, right? So you can deal with wide types of tasks. You can also deal with tasks that have massive amounts of computing. Now, often when we're talking about the human and AI comparison, many people think of it just in terms of capability. But I would actually tell you that there's another piece of this as well, right? And I think that piece is actually trust. So, we had we to be in a actual location together, I would have asked all of you, how many people would be comfortable in getting on a plane with no human pilot, right? And I think, and I'm not sure if we can use the emoticons here, but in any case, I think whenever I ask this question, most people are afraid, right? They say, oh, I want a human being there. There's no question. But I think whenever they say that, they never actually ask how many hours of flying experience does the pilot have? Did they get enough sleep last night? Did they have a couple of nice glasses of wine before the flight? Like nobody has to go through that type of due diligence, but they want a human person there because of trust. Okay, so it's very important, I think, also to understand that the human and AI combination is important, one, from the capability aspect to get this whole box, but then two, also from users using AI, many people want both a human and an AI sitting there together. And I think that's going to be a big challenge for companies going forward. How do we get our customers to trust this stuff and actually use it? And that's both capability, it's also generating trust as well. Now, AI has actually, been around for a long time. Ever since World War II, governments, institutions, universities had always been trying to put this stuff together, but it's only recently been more prevalent in terms of usage, right? So Gabriel mentioned before that he wanted, 2020 flying cars, like all sorts of fun and interesting stuff to happen. But there's a big question as to why that hasn't been the case up until recently. And to answer that, I would be, willing to wager that it's about these three pillars of AI, okay? So one of them is computing, another of storage, and the third one is data transport. And I'll, perhaps share a small story here, but the first computer I ever got, and again, I think I'm dating myself again as a dinosaur, but it was the first, it was a Pentium 90 megahertz processor, okay? The tower computer was like kind of half the size of my desk. It was massive. But if you compare the processing power of what we had in that computer to what you have in your smartphone today, there's no contest, right? So in all these three, there's been exponential increases in capability, and there's also been exponential decreases in cost. So that first computer that I got, way back when, was I think 25 or 20,000 Hong Kong dollars. Whereas if you go to Fortress or any of these, shops today, and you go buy a decent laptop, it'll cost you about 5,000. Right? So that's a 4x, 5x type of reduction for a great increase in capability as well. So I think that part of it is very important, and it's one should keep it in mind as a big reason for why AI is becoming more prevalent these days. Now, among these three, data transport is probably the limiting factor here. And Chris is again going to talk a little bit about IoT and some of the pieces that relate to data being transported and being kind of generated as well. But I think it's important to realize that this potentially is the biggest limiting factor that we have today. And to give you some sense of this, I actually got this screenshot, right? And so back in the day with that Pentium 90 megahertz processor that I actually had a dial-up modem in there. So many of you here might be very young and you don't know what that is. But back in the day, we used to actually connect through the internet through phone lines. And the speed that you can see, and I apologize for the graphic here, is 4.61 kilobytes a second, okay? If you do the math for this 180 megabyte file that's trying to download, it's going to take 39 years. Now, on your current phone, 180 megabyte file on a typical 4G network in Hong Kong will take you less than a minute, right? So 39 years on one side, 1 minute on the other. And I think that, again, should hopefully just give you some insight into that exponential increase in what's going on with data transport. So on the final part of this, important part to remember on the data transport side is what's coming with 5G. Many of you may have heard of it. If you haven't, no problem. But it really stands for the 5th generation of mobile communication networks. And back in the day, when we started with phone lines, again, we used to have copper wires, right? So it's only voice, you pick up the phone, you dial somebody, that's what you use it for. 2G came along, 3G came along, we got data, we got voice, we got video, we got messaging, right? And we've seen technology often develop in parallel to these developments here, right? As your infrastructure networks got better, you eventually were able to do more with your phone. And so, today, most of us are on the 4G network. A few might be on the 5G as well. And I think the dream with 5G going forward is that everything will be connected, right? So obviously, maybe in 10 years, this is me on vacation. But I think the idea is that for everything to then be connected, we'll have all our devices talking to each other all the time. So the second part of the presentation today is really about IoT, and we call that Internet of Things. I'm not going to steal Chris's thunder there, but this is the idea, right? It's going to set the scene for that kind of connected level of data and connected level of devices as well. So the big question then is what types of things are going to be able to be used from this, right? You got 5G, you've got all this AI stuff. And so the examples that I wanted to show as kind of my part of the presentation, we're really looking at the area of what we call in the industry machine vision, okay? So machine vision in AI is about training a machine to collect pictures and derive meaning from that. So we often see use cases of this in autonomous vehicles, right? Or we've got a bunch of cameras that we can also utilize for this stuff as well. What your use case is will determine what type of camera you want to use. So for example, you'd never want to run an autonomous vehicle using the camera on your cell phone, right? Because a camera in an autonomous vehicle is spinning on the roof very, very fast. So that's able to figure out what's going on in the world and then react accordingly. And so there's many different applications of machine vision, but something that I think is going to be really interesting is actually going to be what we call augmented reality, right? AR. And so where AR is being used is often on the side of shopping and inspiration and kind of product demos. So this is actually what I wanted to talk about with this specific part of the presentation. So what you can actually do is if there's a product, let's say a luxury good, a handbag, a shoe, you can actually have that created in what we call augmented reality, meaning we have the current reality that you see through your camera, and then we add or we augment that with this product. So in essence, you can actually see what would this bag look like, right? What would this shoe look like? And I think that often gives people good insight into what potentially this product would look like on them, right? So you could have it in terms of furniture. So you could actually have like a table, you can put it virtually in your house, and you can see how does my living room look with it. And I think that's when people start to, spark the imagination a little bit. In the case of maybe a bag or shoes, you can see how does this look with, certain outfits, right? I'm probably the least fashionable person you'll talk to, but there's maybe a lot of other people that, have different types of outfits and they want to see like, does this bag look good on it? I mean, if we take that perhaps a level further to some luxury goods, there's been quite a few companies that are actually trying to have their watches, and you actually put your picture there, or you can actually be moving in the video, and you can see what does the watch look like on me. Okay, and you can then change the color, you can change a bunch of different models, and you can really see what works for you. And so this helps with customization. So some people on a watch like a metal strap, right? Some people like a leather strap. So you can play with this stuff. You can actually see how does this look like. And I think, technologies like AR, especially in today's world with COVID, I think are even more important. Many people are reluctant to go into a local store, or they're, sitting at home, they don't want to actually go out. So how can you, potentially sell products to people without the offline shopping experience? I think that's a big question that folks in the retail space come and talk to me about. And they say, what are the tools that we have to be able to do this? So I think something like AR becomes actually really interesting, right? And so you can change and literally go through the whole watch store. And if you just want to do this for fun and see how it looks like, that's great too. If you're serious about buying a product and you want to do it, that works for you as well. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of this type of applications of AR going forward as well. The last one that I wanted to show you is just, again, another one from Gucci, right? Where you can actually look at their sneakers. So you effectively take your phone, you point it at your feet, and then you can just switch the different types of shoes that they have to see how that looks like on you. If you want to match it with your pants or do whatever you want, you can change your pants and then go ahead and look at how it looks like there. So again, I think we will start to see a lot of this stuff. And from a technical standpoint, again, you're using machine vision and it's looking at the through the camera, it's looking at your surroundings, and then it's making that new world, if you like, based off the camera input that's coming there. So that's how the machine vision AI part of it is running. And that's how we actually see this application of augmented reality happening in this. So we've seen the examples in shoes, we've seen the examples in a handbag, we've seen the examples in a watch, but you can start to think, right? So much more could be done as well. In the real estate space, for example, many folks have come to us and said, could we just have an open space where somebody puts on a headset, and not only do they do what's called augmented reality, they actually go for full-on virtual reality. Okay, so augmented reality is when you're still, some elements of your current reality are there and we add some new ones. Virtual realities, we create the entire experience all virtually. So if you have, for example, a show flat, right, you're going to buy an apartment. Rather than actually building the apartment, developers can have people put on a headset, walk around an empty room, but they're actually seeing the real apartment there. So in this product demo idea, it's not just a consumer product. We could also have something like real estate or a car. I mean, the possibilities are truly endless. So I'm bringing this up, to show you in a few retail examples, but understand that it could also be generalized to many, many other areas of business as well. So this is definitely one area that I'm very, very excited about going forward. The second part, or I should say the third part of what I wanted to talk about on that sort of idea where how can AI change your business is actually that we're seeing a lot of AI companies or tech companies, I should say, partner with fashion brands. And I think this is potentially a trend that we'll see much more of going forward as well. So if we consider what's being done there, every year they have a very interesting kind of technology show in Las Vegas. Obviously with COVID, that's going to change things, but it's called CES, right? And in CES, many companies demonstrate what is their cool, most interesting types of technology that they're going to be selling or they're working on. So if you're a technology aficionado and there's one conference you're going to go to after COVID, to celebrate the fact that everything is getting better, CES is definitely the one to go to. Now, for CES in 2020, Samsung actually looked at what they were calling their own kind of smart mirrors, okay? And so Neon is kind of their quote unquote virtual assistant. So imagine rather than having Siri on your phone, you actually have a quote unquote, avatar or virtual person in the mirror, and they can actually do a lot of things for you, okay? So in the case of the augmented reality piece we were talking about before, you can actually have yourself there and you can try on a bunch of different clothes, right? Whether that's pants, shoes, sweaters, it's like taking augmented reality on your phone, but then actually adding one level on top of that. So you can change everything about your outfit. Now, in addition to that, you can actually have that avatar in itself also do a bunch of other use cases. So many people today often say that they struggle to go to the gym because of COVID. So one of the big use cases that Samsung's looking at is actually having this person be your personal trainer, right? So they're doing the exercises kind of in front of you, and you've got to mimic what they're doing. So you get your workout with a virtual trainer, right? So even though we have the smart mirror, the augmented reality, and we use it for fashion, there's so many other different type of use cases that are coming up as well. So again, I think part of my and Christoph's objective today is just to help you dream a little bit more, help you kind of get you a little bit more inspired and excited, because although we don't have the flying cars, I think we're going to get to some very other interesting use cases as well. So that's part of I think our job today. Now I think these types of partnerships are definitely going to happen because a lot of the luxury brands bring the kind of the fashion piece of it, and the technology companies bring their tech know-how and the technology capability. And so with regards to these types of partnerships, this is one that I wanted to highlight, but we see so many more of these types of things happening today as well. So in this case, what happened is Huawei, who's the big kind of Chinese tech company that many of you I'm sure have heard about, is partnering with a company called Gentle Monster. So Gentle Monster is a Korean eyewear company. And so they got together and they said, hey, look, we want to make augmented reality smart glasses, right? So these things are basically going to have a lot of inbuilt technology that's there. If you walk around, or let's say you're reading a book, you can actually have that thing start to read what it's seeing, right? You can also use that as your phone. So you hit the button, you basically are able to answer calls and put down calls without even moving your phone or looking at your watch. So even though the technology piece is quite useful there, some of these like Google Glasses and things in the past have actually not been that successful. And a lot of the speculation about why that's the case is because the design wasn't there. It wasn't, aesthetically pleasing to wear it. It didn't look good. So many people didn't kind of, appreciate that. And so I think when you combine both that kind of fashion sense and that design capability with technology, then you start seeing some really, really interesting applications as well. So I think going forward, we are definitely going to see more of these types of partnerships. And so if you're on the luxury side and you're in that industry, keep an eye on technology, right? If there are some tech partners that might be interesting, there are some innovations that you like and you think would be helpful for your business, might not be a bad idea to start some of these conversations with the tech companies there as well. So that's really all I had for my part. Perhaps one final piece before I hand it off to Chris is that, I really enjoy these types of chats about, AI, technology, and always happy to chat with anybody about them. So feel free after the presentation, if you're shy during the Q&A, feel free to kind of add me and Chris, I'm sure, over LinkedIn as well. And I'm sure we'll be happy to chat with you going forward as well. But we'll keep, I think, half an hour for the Q&A today. So keep your questions there, and I'll be definitely back with Chris after his part to share the other pieces of our answers to the Q&A and other pieces you guys might be interested in. Okay, Chris, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. So let me see if I can share my screen. I'm doing this one. And then it is present. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the invite, Gabriel and Nicole. And I'd like to share a little bit some insights on the world of IoT. First, again, Gabriel made a nice introduction about my background. Just a few, I won't lose a lot of time on it. Essentially, I'm born and I grew up in Switzerland. And then in 2005, I graduated from the University of the Arts in Zurich. So I have a slightly different background, but I was always into technology. And then in 2005, I went to London, specializing in building technology platforms, working for a Swiss technology company where we're doing billing for mobile billing for companies around the world. In 2009, I set up my own company. We were also specializing in platforms, as mentioned before. And then we grew that company to around 80 people with 2 offices, one in London and one in Seattle. And this company then we sold to Asterio, whom I'm working for today in 2017. Essentially, I'm working now with Asterio on the IoT product called Gravio. A little bit about, I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect. Yeah, I'll share some words about Asterio as well, who we are. The motto of Asterio is connecting the future, right? So we believe that there's a lot of possibilities to connect things in the future, and we've been doing that from many different in many different ways. We're a stock listed company on a Tokyo Stock Exchange, main listed. We have around 120 employees globally, so it's relatively small. Our headquarters in Tokyo. We have offices in Osaka, Hangzhou, Singapore, London, and some small offices. So we're now trialing out also, a lot of small offices where people can actually work remotely from around the world. The main product of Asterio is Asterio Warp, which is an application integration platform. That means you can connect all sorts of different types of software with each other inside your organization. And that's kind of the central hub of it. But a few years ago, Asterio decided we don't only want to be part of connecting software with each other, we also wanted to go into connecting physical space to software, which is why we then started to create Gravio, the IoT edge computing platform. And why edge computing is important? Edge computing is the other thing to cloud computing. It's the opposite of cloud computing, so to speak. I will get into that in a minute as well. So first of all, what is IoT and why is it so important? IoT stands for the Internet of Things. And the reason why it's important is up until now, we have been talking of the internet as mainly the internet of humans, right? So the internet is mainly there to connect humans that have something to say or something to publish with people who want to consume. But it's mainly driven around people, whether it's email or messengers or even websites. It's always about human-to-human communication. Now, of course, there's an additional layer to all these communication possibilities, which is if you start connecting not only people with each other, but start connecting things with each other as well. And things can be anything, it can be mobile phones, houses, or even businesses that can communicate with each other in a more or less automated fashion, and of course, augmented by artificial intelligence and machine learning. And one of the very important developments that we just had very recently is, of course, as Kevin mentioned, the development of 5G technology. 5G technology enables a much higher connectivity, much broader bandwidth between things being connected, but there's also optimizations in, for example, energy consumption, and then there's also some optimizations in the latency, which is a very, very important thing. If you have many different things communicating with each other, a big problem at the moment is still latency. That means there's always a small delay between the communication, and if you compound that over many different things that need to communicate with each other, it becomes very easily out of sync. So 5G promises to reduce that and actually enable us to be much more interconnected with things within each other, but amongst things each other in particular. So on one end of the spectrum, we will have self-driving cars, of course, which is kind of the most sophisticated, or one of the most sophisticated Internet of Things device that you can think of. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, there's a lot of machine vision involved in that, where there's a lot of things being interpreted like with robotic eyes, so to speak. Now, one thing that I find really fascinating about self-driving cars is if you think about if you remember, maybe a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, there was an unfortunate fatal accident with a self-driving car somewhere in America. Now, because this car was very heavily equipped with sensors and with machine learning and with data harvesting, this is one of the most analyzed accidents that you can ever imagine, because we have so much data about it and so much information that how and when it happened. Now, if you think about self-driving cars, taking this information, learning from it and learning from its mistakes, and within minutes, propagate it amongst all the other available cars, in theory, you end up with a world where no two accidents will ever happen because the whole ecosystem should learn by itself. Of course, there are some security implications that people are thinking about and these kind of things as well. But the principle of kind of a collective learning of intelligent devices is a very important thing in the future that we have to think of. Then on the other side of the spectrum of a very simple IoT device is this toaster that a company called Toastery was at least raising some fund on Kickstarter. And the idea was that this toaster was connected to the internet, and every morning when you use the toaster, what it would do is it would basically print the weather of today on the toaster, or even some news or whatever you want. The key is that it is connected to the internet, and therefore it can be used in a new dimension almost, or in a new fashion. Of course, one of the biggest things in IoT, or low-hanging fruits in IoT, is predictive maintenance. We are now living in a world where a lot of supply chains are very intertwined, and there's a lot of just-in-time production. And one of the key things to understand is when do things break before they break, so you can actually prevent them from breaking, preventing from having a gap in production. And so forth. So IoT is becoming very important there. You can save a lot of time and a lot of money if you get that right. And of course, there is no Swiss Chamber of Commerce event, without some featuring of some cow as a Swiss animal. So there is actually a project, or there's a few projects where they're making smart cows, where they basically for example, have a necklace. You can there's a Connectera, that's a Dutch company. They make like a Fitbit type of device for cows, so they know how they move and if they are sick before they're getting sick and things like that. You can find patterns. And also one very important thing with cows, apparently, I found that out in this research, is the reproduction, of course. So they can find out when is a good time for the cow to have babies, so they find that out with sensors. Another company called Well Cow, they actually put sensors in the cow's belly to find out what's the acidity levels, and they can find digestive problems. Then there's another company, they measure tail movements, which also has a lot of indication on how the cow is feeling, and again related to cow birth. It can detect if something's happening, and then when it's connected to the mobile networks, send out text messages. Then there's another sensor company. What they do is they detect if everything is okay with the milk production, and they can also alert people accordingly when there's issues with that as well. Then Afimilk, that's an Israeli company, similar to the first company. They work on pedometers as well, again for the same reason as the first company. So you can see, that the more you can actually detect, the more you can optimize and also prevent things, bad things from happening. Another very big case of IoT is actually is a supply chain and provenance. Yeah. So one of the big problems that you have nowadays is for example, counterfeiting, or wrong declaration, or even just not finding where the origin of certain goods is, or where certain goods come from and where they've been. And one big way of doing this is making a system that allows you to index and to basically map all of these items around the world, and then finding ways of tracking and tracing them. So there's many different ways that this is happening. So for example, a friend of mine who has an IoT company called Everything, they're based in Switzerland as well. The headquarters is in Switzerland. What they are doing, they're working with label companies that make label for fashion brands, you know, for the shirts and so on, where they would put unique IDs in there, and people can then use them to scan them with the phone, and then identify whether something is a counterfeited product or not. And the key in a situation like this is that that you have basically the possibility that in any point of time, in any part of the supply chain, you can basically verify where this item has been or where it hasn't been. Another one is with visual identification. So, for example, if you have pieces of meat that are you know, being cut, like steaks and so on, each of them has a very unique shape and a unique way of how it looks. So they can take pictures of that in the supply chain when they package it, and then, you know, technically they can be registered in a database, and then people can always verify you know, where they have been and where they went through. Of course, one big challenge in these kind of situations is how do you make sure that you know, these data, where the thing has not been tampered with. And that is then where the whole blockchain topic comes into play, where you basically have, you know, various items in various places in various times at the on the globe, and this gets written into a blockchain where it gets verified independently by various other people who have also mobile devices, and therefore it makes it really difficult to tamper. It's almost like crowdsourcing, or, you know, the crowd or the people bottom up try to find and identify where they are, and therefore validate previous sets of data. So all of this, of course, requires that things have their own identity and have their ways of being addressed in a digital way online, and that's where the IoT becomes also very, very important. So retrofitting is a big topic in IoT. So you can't just from one day to another you know, change everything to the latest and greatest technology, even though if we like to do that, that won't be possible. So what we have to do is we have to retrofit things. So I'm giving you 2 examples of how retrofitting works. So this is Bob. And as you can see in the background, maybe vaguely, he's working in an ice cream factory. He's also testing some ice cream here at the moment. He's basically responsible for quality assurance. But because he's been working in this ice cream factory for quite a long time, he actually very well knows, you know, how each single machine sounds, right? And as soon as one little machine sounds slightly off, he knows, oh, there's something going wrong with his machine. We need to be careful. We need to grease it, whatever it is. He knows exactly from hearing it. He just listens very carefully to the machines, and he can identify problems. It's a bit like when your fan of your laptop starts to kind of buzz a little bit, then you go like, oh yeah, maybe it's time for a new fan or laptop or something like that. So this is obviously a very effective way of finding faults. I was talking about predictive maintenance in before, which is one of the big topics even in the insurance industry. And what then some IoT companies have been doing in terms of retrofitting is they've basically taken some normal, you know, microphones, or maybe some more advanced microphones, and they just put them in the factories or in the engine rooms or in places. There's a big company that's doing this. Is called Neuron Soundware, and what they then do is they run it against machine learning and artificial intelligence, the sound that they hear, similar to what Kevin described, and then they identify patterns if something is actually not working properly, and this allows them to identify where the problems are before they are, and therefore address them accordingly. So this is one example where you can just literally use a very basic technology augmented with artificial intelligence and as very sophisticated sensors, where others actually could, you know, make, you know, very, very expensive equipment to do that. Another example of retrofitting is if you look at this shop, you see like it's a normal shop. If you look on the ceiling, you will find that there's there's quite a few security cameras, and these security cameras have probably been there for a while now, because security cameras have been for a while now. But there is a standard in security camera systems called ONVIF. ONVIF stands for Open Open Network Video Interface Forum. So that's like a forum that decides the standards of how these security systems talk to each other. And I'm guessing that this is just recording some data and storing it somewhere on a hard drive or somewhere on a tape in case something happens. But if you use retrofitting, you can actually do much more. You can actually, again, plug this system into our system, for example, that we do that, and with Gravio. And then what you can do is you can train it to detect stuff. So you can train it, for example, like with machine learning, to detect people who are coming in. How you can measure how long they're standing in front of certain shelves. You can detect. You can basically use a camera CCTV system that's been around for a very long time as an augmented with artificial intelligence, and then use it in new ways that were not even intended in the first place. Now, one thing that is very important, I was talking about edge computing versus cloud computing in the past, in a previous slide. So what you don't want is all these video camera feeds going somewhere into the cloud, some even going through the internet. You essentially never want them to leave your premise because of data protection, privacy, and all sorts of topics where that you don't want even security, that you don't want it necessarily to be connected to the internet. And that is why it's important to think about edge computing rather than cloud computing, because what edge computing does is the brain of a smart space is actually within the space. The computer doesn't sit somewhere in the cloud, somewhere connected to the internet. It's actually doing all the calculations and the recognition on site, and it never leaves the space. And the idea is that you can actually even discard the images that you found, that you have. Let's say you do counting of people. So you count the people in a picture, you discard the amount of the picture after you've counted it, and then you turn basically a visual feed into a tabular data where you just see at this point of time, this amount of people were in the shop, at this point of time, this amount of people were in the shop, and so on. And then you can start continuing, and you can actually start finding correlations where you say, let's see if we bake Zopf, like a very famous Swiss bread, you can see if the footfall increases if you bake Zopf, or if you because of the smells, right? Or if you turn the lights down and the music down, do more people come in? Or if you change the color of the light to cold when it's hot outside, or vice versa, turn the light warm when it's cold outside, can you have an impact on the footfall? And this way, a self-learning machine learning IoT device can then self-learn and optimize the shop automatically for optimal footfall, for example, right? This is an example where our system, we used it in our booth. We exhibited in the IoT London, where we use a standard off-the-shelf security camera, and then just counted the amount of people who were walking past. And basically you get some confidence levels of how confident the system is. This is a person. You can even do gender recognition and so on. Basically anything that you can train that's visually recognizable, you can train the machine to do, and then therefore you can learn. You can use it as a sensor, so to speak. You can use any camera as a sensor. So what about the future then? So in the future, of course, certain things will change for everyone with all of these new technologies, and I will share two ways I think IoT will change businesses, or hopefully change the thinking of your business. So number one is, digital transformation was so 1999, right? So if you follow me on LinkedIn and see my publications, you will see that I'm a very big opponent of the word digital transformation. I'm not a fan at all. And the reason why I think digital transformation is not the right word, and it's not even the right approach, is digital is a word that basically says we can now do paper ledgers in digital databases kind of thing, right? So it's like moving away from paper into databases. But actually what's really the magic of our time nowadays, what's really making the difference is not digital transformation, it's the connectedness transformation. It's the way that we connect everything in new ways. It's the way that we can connect consumers with businesses. It's the way that businesses can connect with each other. The way that entities of businesses can connect with other entities of other businesses in new ways. And we are now entering a phase where many businesses in the future might just basically be just a set of what we call in technology term APIs. That means application integration interface. That means like it's almost, you can imagine, it's like a set of instructions that you can send, and then something result that you get back. So for example, in my view, we can think of a financial institution in the future just as a set of APIs where then other people can basically, and other businesses can just integrate in an automated way, because everything is so highly interconnected. And I think rather than focusing on digitalization or digital transformation, people should focus on the connectedness of their business. How connected is their business, and how much can it be connected, not only digitally, but also to the physical space, especially if you are in a brick and mortar or in a supply chain or in a business where connectedness can increase the value of your business so much. So there's actually a term for this. It's called the enterprise component model, where you can look at companies in the future just as being componentized parts of business logics or business entities that then can interact very fluidly as and when they need with other businesses and components. Of course, there's a lot to sort out. How do you build for this? Business model, service level agreements. How do you make sure that and then the whole idea, when something goes wrong, if everything's so interconnected, how do you actually make sure there's the liabilities are in the right place, and so on and so forth. But overall, we can and we should focus on making all our businesses more interconnected and more interconnectable. Then the second takeaway is in the past, or I would argue in the present, we pay shop rent space per time, right? So we pay a monthly fee for a certain amount of feet or square meters per month. That's for living, that's for a shop, that's for anything. But in the early days when advertising was like this, you would pay advertising per 1,000 views. Yeah, you say 1,000 people see my advertising in the newspapers, in the radio, in the TV, and it costs you a certain amount of money. But this has actually changed now, right? People now pay advertising online per click, right? Or even per customer, or per actual transaction. And this works very well in the digital space, because of course in the digital space everything is very trackable and everything is very traceable. So Google has very easy ways to find out if they actually clicked on an advertising, and then all the way used Google Wallet to check out and buy. So therefore Google has the whole the chain in sight and can actually find out how much they could charge per sale very easily from a technical point of view. But the question is, why don't we do that also in the real space, right? Now we're paying, a shop pays, a certain amount of Hong Kong dollars per month for rent. What if we actually change the business model in the future, where we actually say, we don't charge per time and space, we actually charge per customer that has entered the shop. And when we think of this in this way, it's a completely new business model. What that means is you need to find reliable ways, IoT ways to detect, how many people have actually gone into the shop. And of course, the tenant will have a different incentive than the landlord, will have a different incentive than the tax man, for example. So you will have to find a way that for sure counts the right amount, that is indisputable. And the way that you would do that is you would have a system that will be controlled by different people. So one system is controlled by the landlord, one system is controlled by the shop owner, and then they would agree and they will put it on a blockchain again, and therefore nobody can dispute that how many people. It's like two people sitting there at the door and counting the people, and they always look at each other when somebody enters. Yes, somebody's just gone in. tick, tick, tick. And this is how they would agree on and make sure they have a secure ledger of the people coming. There's actually a nice use case from a company called Hilti in Switzerland, Swiss company. They make machines for like drills and like drills and construction equipment, and they faced fierce competition from outside Switzerland, where some companies would make cheaper drills and cheaper equipment for construction. So what Hilti did is they turned to IoT, and what they did is they started to stop charging for a drill, but actually charging for each hole that somebody makes with a drill. And for that, of course, you need a drill that accurately measures the amount of holes and is unfalsifiable. And the reason why this is important is if you pay per hole and not per drill, then you suddenly want a machine that lasts very, very long, because you don't want the interruption of getting a new machine. And suddenly, you can spread the cost. And there's all sorts of new ways that you start thinking about how the whole business works, because you pay per hole and not per drill. And the hole is essentially what people want. That's why you buy a drill, is because you want to make a hole. And why not pay for the holes rather than for the drill? So this is something that IoT is perfectly able to enable. And then the third thing that I want to talk about today is, at the moment, we still think of operating system as a piece of software that runs our computers, our mobile phones, our tablets, and so on. But we have to start rethinking what an operating system does. We have to start thinking literally outside the box. And when we start thinking outside the box, what we learn is, there are operating systems going to be in the future that allow you to connect physical space with the digital space and actually unlock the power of the physical space to the software, with software. And I was making this example earlier with the clicks and paying per clicks, and with the drills where you pay per hole. These are typical examples where you have physical things happening in the physical space, and then you can map them up with IoT software, with an IoT platform, to actually rethink the business models, or rethink anything that that we had in the status quo. Now, some of you might have been asking, what is this Gravio logo on the top left of my slides? And of course, I'm very excited about this topic. And what I am actually doing now is working on this platform together with Asterio, and building more apps. And literally, the imagination is the limit. Building apps for the physical space with the range of sensors. It's like a toolkit that we can use in so many different ways. So that's why. So if you like to know more about this, I'm very happy to talk to you and grab a coffee with you to see to discuss. That's my part. Thank you very much. Some images.
Thank you very much, Christoph and Kevin. It was a fascinating presentation. We are going to open the floor to questions. I'm sure people in the room have heard many interesting things today. So you can either unmute yourself and ask the question directly, or start typing it in chat. So please, the floor is yours, everybody. Don't be shy.
Hi, this is Robert here. Could I ask one question here?
Sure.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can talk a bit about machine learning. I think it was mentioned a couple of times, but it wasn't clear. But maybe in the context of what you spoke about, it mainly, I guess in the content of your presentation, it was mainly about performing an intelligent function on behalf of a human, but it's trained by human. So, it isn't much of a machine learning by itself. So I was wondering if you can speak about that and maybe give some examples.
Sure. So on the machine learning side, right, on a very high level, it's really about training a machine to recognize patterns and predict outcomes. Okay, so on a very high level. So within the sort of area of machine learning, there's kind of many different approaches, but I think you can put them into, let's say, two buckets. So bucket one is what we call supervised learning. So supervised learning is where you get the machine to go from certain input to certain output. So the classical example of that is a regression line, right? I put in my x variables, goes into the equation, I get my kind of result at the end. Now, where AI has been more interesting on the machine learning side is on unsupervised learning. So unsupervised learning says, I just give you data and then you go and figure out what's going on, right? So I think, your question was, you have a person training it and that's not as interesting. I would say a lot of that falls under the supervised model, whereby you just train from input to output. But I think the more interesting parts that I think me and probably Chris are also seeing as well is on the unsupervised learning, where you really let the computer figure out what are those correlations, and then you sit and explore them. I think that's where the real potential for machine learning lies. Chris, maybe anything to add on that?
No, I think it's a perfect description. But maybe one anecdote that I came across recently was they were training a computer to distinguish a dog from a wolf, right? As Kevin said a long time ago, earlier today, is that it's very, very difficult to distinguish different animals. And so they were doing this. They were training this machine. So they sent them thousands and thousands of pictures, and somebody says, yes, this is a wolf, yes, this is a dog, yes, this is a wolf, and so on. And then the computer kept making errors, and you can keep correcting them. So the computer became better and better. But then what they found out is, after a while, is they found out that the computer was actually not detecting whether it's a wolf or a dog from the face of the animal. It was actually just mainly checking if there's snow in the background, and if there's snow in the background, it's probably a wolf. So there's these kind of random correlation that can happen also. So you need to really feed it good data in order for it to have good learning. So that's one of these examples that just popped into my mind. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these answers. All right, well, I'll throw one in the meantime in order to sustain the conversation. So when it comes to AI, I'm more of a skeptic than a bull. I like football, for instance, and I'm fond of video games. And one of my favorite quips about AI is always that I'll see it as a threat when the computer-controlled team in FIFA will be somewhat realistic. Now, in practical terms, people are still worried about their jobs and of all the disruption, the increased connectedness of the way we do business is going to disrupt them. And I would like to ask you, where do you see the most immediate and dangerous threat on actual types of job from AI?
Yeah, great question. I guess from my experience, right, I would see the whole idea of AI replacing people as a sort of battle between augmentation, right, and substitution. So I think for the most part, short and medium term, it's going to be much more augmentation. So basically, pilot sits in there, they have an autopilot that helps them, and everybody works together. The one area I think we're going to see a lot of substitution quickly is actually within the autonomous driving space, right? So that's when we completely take the driver out of the picture, and it's just the AI driving by itself. Now, as we mentioned before, when it's complicated driving, it's hard for an AI to deal with. So I think, for example, when we have these large trucks, right? So trucking, where most of the driving is highway, straight, not that complicated. Those are very good scenarios for AI to be able to replicate, right? And so therefore, I would say like within transportation, I think that's a big one. And within transportation, there's the trucking element. So I think that would be one area that I think is going soon. But for those people who are concerned about their jobs, the other thing I would say is when you're thinking about this automation idea, right? Don't think about it as job automation. Think about it as task automation. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So I think every job has a bunch of tasks, right? So let's say 10 tasks there. I think some of them are automatable and some of them are not. So the real question, I think, for HR folks and our human capital resource thinking is really about if these 3 jobs within the 10, or I should say 3 tasks within the 10 are automatable, then do we give this person 3 more tasks? Or do we allow that person to then concentrate 100% of their effort on the remaining 7, right? And my sense is the real answer is somewhere in between. But I think for all of us, the thought on our own job should be, what are the tasks that are there? Are they automatable? Are they not? And then I think from a personal development standpoint, we should also start thinking about what are skill sets that are hard to automate and start working on those from a professional development standpoint. So don't be scared of AI. Understand that it's coming though, and understand that it's good at certain things. So I think that just means that we have to prepare ourselves in other ways to become relevant in the workforce of the future? But that's a very pertinent question. I think a lot of people have that fear. So I just wanted to say that to hopefully make everybody feel better that their jobs are not going to get taken away tomorrow.
Thanks, Kevin. Chris, do you want to comment on this?
No, perfect.
That's good. All right. Other questions from the floor?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Guillaume speaking here. I have one question for Kevin. You talked about augmented reality and with the example of retail shopping using, for example, our iPhones or other devices. Is it already, or you think it will be a challenge in terms of data privacy for consumers? The fact that we're using our, I guess, camera from the phone to try on shoes or etc.
Yeah, no, great question, right? I think the data privacy thing is not only applicable to AR and product demos, but I think it's applicable to a lot of other pieces as well, right? Again, if all of us were sitting in the same room, I would ask everybody, how many of you review the terms and conditions when you download an app, right? And I'm willing to bet that most people say no. And I think why your question, Guillaume, is very good is because I think we need to be more aware going forward, right? If Candy Crush needs access to my photos, the right response to that is, why does Candy Crush need access to my photos, right? So I think we all need to become smarter about, how we interact with companies and allow them to use our data. And I think secondly, we need to be aware that a lot of these free things are not really free. We're just paying with our data rather than paying with money. And so I think being consciously aware of that transaction for everyone is very, very important. Like, I'm not saying don't play Candy Crush or do play Candy Crush. I'm saying understand what you're giving up for playing that free game of Candy Crush. And if you're okay with it, then as a conscious decision, say yes. Okay, and I think that's important. So to relate to your question about privacy, I think when all these apps kind of get set up, at the beginning, you have to kind of tick the box and say, okay, on the privacy side. And so I think, the benefit you get would be to try out a product that you're not normally used to. And I think what you give up is potentially some of your data as well. So as with anything else, it's a transaction. So I would say the most important thing is to be aware of what are you giving up on the transaction. And if it's worth it to you, then go ahead and do it, but make it a conscious choice.
Okay, thank you. So you think it's more a responsibility of the customers?
Yeah, so specifically with that, right? I think when it comes to large companies like, a Google or a Facebook, I think the responsibility, it's a little bit harder because if you've actually looked at Google's terms and conditions, it's like pages upon pages. I've actually printed it out. Yeah. Literally, it's a pile of paper, right? So I think for that, governments and some of these bodies need to assume some of that responsibility. But I think until that happens, the responsibility will lie with individual consumers. And so I think there it's incumbent upon us to make those choices, or B, lobby for governments or our political representatives to do that on behalf of us. So I think the core responsibility will still be with us. Execution could be either with us or with someone else that we nominate in the future.
Right. And maybe just to add on your example of the brand Tissot with the watches. Mm-hmm. So yeah, for this case, the responsibility would be more for Tissot, the customer, or the technology provider who's providing the AR technology.
Yeah, again, it's a really hard one, right? Because it depends on how they internally allocate. Like when Chris had brought up the earlier example of a car hitting someone, one of the big questions from a legal precedent standpoint is who's liable? Is it the software developer? Is it the car manufacturer? Is it the person in the car? And the truth is, most of these things have not been sorted out yet, right? So a lot of the legal precedents are not done. And so therefore, it's still an open question as to if something goes wrong, who's responsible? So there's no clear answer right now. I think what will happen is, and it's unfortunate, but I think this is the way regulation works. They don't figure it out until something bad happens. Yeah. Right. So I think we will see something bad happen. We will see a couple of examples of that. And then I think you get kind of the established practice sorted out. I think there's going to be a little bit of a difference between Europe and Asia, because I think Europe's view on data privacy is a lot stricter. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think there will be some country differences as well. So I think these are all considerations that companies are going to need to have. And I think without this stuff getting sorted, AI and IoT as well will still have a little bit of friction in terms of being adopted everywhere, because these are the pieces now that need to get sorted out. I think the technology's there. I think Chris is, can talk about it more than I can. But for the most part, even within AI, the technology is sitting there for autonomous vehicles. It's just a question of, a lot of companies are scared to use it because they're not sure if something goes wrong, what actually happens. And so I think it's going to be an interesting part of AI and IoT development going forward to see how this regulatory. But that's a very good question, Guillaume.
Yeah. Thank you for your answers.
I think part of the solution to all of this will also be related to blockchain technology and the idea that you own your data and you can unlock it for the people who need it, just for the time they need. I make an example. When you go online and buy like a pair of shoes, your shop, the shop who sells you the shoes, they will know your name, they will know your address, they will know your shoe size, they will know your gender, they will know a lot about you, and of course they can use that data for many other things if they wanted to. Even though they just use this address to do the shipping, they can actually interpolate how much your disposable income is because of the postcode and so on and so forth. But if you actually go into a normal brick and mortar shop and buy a set of shoes and you pay in cash, they know nothing about you. They know how you look, they know your gender and maybe how tall you are, but that's it, and they can't even reuse it. So what we need to strive towards is in the future is that we find a way that you can, similar like when you go and shop something, you only give the information away that they need in order to fulfill their whatever they need to fulfill, but everything else remains completely anonymous, and you are the only person who has the key to unlock all of these things with respect to all the other people who are inside this transaction. So this is something that's still kind of a little bit science fiction at the moment, but there are some very smart brains at the moment working on solutions for this, hopefully in the interest of protecting the people's identity and protecting the people's anonymity. And in fact, it's become a political scenario now as well with all this, all the data that we put somewhere in the internet is very likely, most likely going somewhere on an American server. That's becoming a big problem generally. Yes.
Hi, Gabriel. This is Pauline from SwissChair, Malaysia. I'd like to thank you for inviting us and our members to join. I think it's an excellent event, and the speakers was really wonderful and sharing very relevant topics to us today on both on IoT, right, and AI. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Pauline. Thank you. Thanks to you for attending.
Hello, everybody. This is Patrick. Thank you to both of the speakers for the interesting presentation. I had a question because recently I read an article about Dubai implementing a program called Smart Dubai 2021, which is like a project to make the city more seamless, safe, efficient, and personalized, and so on. So it seems that the UAE have understood the importance on making everything interconnected. So since we are in Hong Kong, my question is, do you have the impression that also the local Hong Kong government may understand the relevance of IoT and potentially include it in the city's transformation agenda for the future?
I can probably help answering part of that question, but I leave it to Christoph and Kevin first.
I only arrived in January, so I haven't been involved much in any local initiatives. Although I know that there's a big push in the government to actually tackle some issues with what they call the double aging problem. The double aging problem means Hong Kong is currently suffering from the issue that the infrastructure is getting more and more older, thinking of, houses that don't have lifts and things like that. But at the same time, the people are getting older as well. So we have this double this double aging problem, which is a big challenge that this is getting increasingly more acute. So now the idea is, how can we use smart buildings? How can we use infrastructure, IoT, and things like that to tackle this problem, making life easier for an ever-aging population by retrofitting or rethinking the way that people move about the city, people move about the buildings, even aging, finding even. Some people might, for example, fall in a stair, and you need sensors to detect this kind of stuff. Otherwise, the people's lives depend on it. So there's a big push in tackling this double aging problem in Hong Kong. In terms of the whole connectedness and connectivity, I think there is some interesting developments there as well. I heard that there are some ideas to interconnect financial institutions across the Bay Area, for example, using protocols and ways of communication that should then leverage and augment the whole Bay Area by being more interconnected with each other. So I don't know much about this. I heard it's a big financial industry kind of project going on there, but I need to do more research into how that works.
Yeah, for my end, right? We've actually had a couple of projects in Dubai, and they're looking at some very interesting stuff on the smart city side. I think one of the interesting contrasts between a place like Dubai, and I'd put Myanmar in this bucket as well, is that they currently do not have legacy infrastructure. When you don't have legacy infrastructure, you can put the top-notch technology in the ground from day one. I think the challenge with a place like Hong Kong, it's been great for a while, but the problem is when you have legacy infrastructure, you have to take out the old pipe and put in the new pipe. And so I think from a 5G perspective, that's going to take a little bit of time to figure out. And so I think a lot of the, at least on the connectivity side, I've talked to a few of the providers here, and so they are working on a lot of that. It's taking some time, but I think why Hong Kong's an interesting one for that is because a lot of these 5G receivers, right? On a very high level, the range is a lot less for an individual receiver, but it can actually be connected to many more devices, and it's orders of magnitude there. So with a place like high population density like Hong Kong, it's actually a very good candidate for using a lot of 5G and using a lot of this infrastructure. So, I would agree with Chris. I think there's a lot of legacy stuff here, and that's a challenge. I think the opportunity for Hong Kong is because of its demographics, a 5G rollout here is perhaps less difficult than perhaps somewhere that's much more spread out. So I think that's the opportunity in some ways for a place like Hong Kong.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll complete what you just said, gentlemen, and thank you for your answer on that by reminding that Hong Kong has unveiled 1 or 2 years ago a smart city blueprint that is available for all to see on the internet around a number of strategic goals around smart mobility, smart living, smart environment, smart government, smart economy. So it's largely a blueprint, but there has been a few initiatives that have been taken already in that regard. And if that's something that is of interest to you, Patrick, I invite you to have a look. I'll share the link on the chat so that everybody can have a look. But yes, there is definitely a strategic intent from the Hong Kong government to also use the Internet of Things and other technological innovations in order to make the city smarter and more efficient.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Any other questions from the floor? We still have 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll have to wrap up. Well, I have another one, actually. In terms of business applications, what do you see as the most meaningful changes that we can expect to see in the services industry, which is pretty strong in Hong Kong, financial services, professional services, in terms of day-to-day business impact when it comes to IoT and AI? For instance, I saw you mention earlier the work that Gravio is doing around connecting internal systems. I know within my own company, we use a host of different systems and software, and although the firm as a whole is moving towards greater integration, this is definitely a challenge. Look at the leave system, the payroll system, the intranet, the CRM system, the finance system, the HR and people management system. How do you see this is part of what is going to evolve, or do you see other areas? I'd be interested to hear your views.
Yes, so the whole interoperability is always a big problem, right? You can even see it in your home when you have a Google system and an Apple system for smart automation, and they don't talk to each other, right? In fact, Google and Apple and Amazon, they're currently losing money on IoT for for market share. They're trying to bleed each other out for market share. But the end game of this is not that one can do everything. The end game of this is everything is super interoperable. So what you want to do is you want a system or a protocol or something that's kind of a common language that all of these can talk to each other ultimately, and therefore connect everything up. Because there's no way that, for example, Apple will ever do, let's say, a fridge, or I don't know, maybe they do, but there's certain things that some company will never do. So that the only way forward is that the fridge can talk the language that everyone else can talk, and therefore everything will be able to come up. I mean, one big attempt to get this done was using the XML standard in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But well, HTML is part of it, of course, which is the web, the whole web is based on. But it's still not there yet. This kind of common language for everyone is still not there. But that definitely, being able to talk a language, like being an interpreter of all of these different things, where everything comes together, that is certainly a big benefit. And if you can then connect physical space to it as well, that means you speak an additional whole set of languages. Then that's definitely the low-hanging fruit going forward.
Gabriel, I guess the answer to your question, I feel like we could do another webinar on that, but if I had to pick maybe like one area that I think is really interesting for me from an AI perspective, I would say it's actually healthcare, right? And the reason why I think that's the case is because historically healthcare has always been reactive, right? You get sick, you go to the hospital. I think now that we can start looking at people's kind of scans and stuff, and if you know how disease progression happens, and you can see that in a scan over a large number of data, you can start to predict in 5 years, 10 years, you're going to get this disease. And
I sent to you and Nicholas also on AI.
Sorry, Eileen, may I
excuse me and Hong Kong, you're combined.
Okay. Yeah. And so what I was saying is on the healthcare side, right? I do think, when it comes to predicting and prevent, Chris talked about preventive maintenance. I actually think there's a predictive or preventative healthcare aspect that's coming too. And I think if we can really sort that out and actually, address diseases from before they happen, we can realistically increase lifespans by, I would say, a good 10, 20 years. So if we all live to 100, we have to think about what we're going to do in the last 20 years, different issue, but probably a good problem to have. So, healthcare, definitely an area that I'm really, really excited about from an AI perspective.
Yeah, I would tend to agree on that. This is right up my alley, and predictive healthcare analytics and anticipating diseases in order for insurers, for instance, to reduce their tail risks, or for doctors to be able to accurately predict the evolution of medical conditions is definitely going to be a big topic. Maybe something for a separate discussion another day, because in itself it's a fascinating subject. Thank you very much for your answers, both of you. We have the time for one last question, and if not, I will wrap up. No? Well, with that, I believe that everybody is fairly hungry since it's already 1:30 in the afternoon. But thank you very much again, Christoph and Kevin, for your insights. It was a very insightful sessions. And I do hope to be able to meet you at one of our events in the not too distant future. Thanks everybody for joining. Don't forget to follow our feeds on social media, and we'll keep you posted about the next events and webinar that we are organizing. So thanks, and see you next time.
Thank you very much. Have a good week. Bye.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Have
Bye.
a good weekend.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.